Due to the lack of census data in September, the date will be December 31st, and not to correct you, Governor, on record, but I'm going to have to make sure that it's December 31st, not December 30th, so that way our oral and written evidence matches. But this will give us time to ensure that the districts that we draw with the public's input and with our respective experts meet all the qualifications and requirements that we have to look at, whether it's to ensure that the districts are contiguous. I know that we have incumbents who will be looking very closely at our districts, and this is important to the citizens of those districts, that we try, as the population has moved significantly from some parts of the state to other parts of the state where we've had rapid growth and others where we've had rapid decline, to make sure that the lines that we draw are consistent and under the Constitution, that they are in compliance with the 14th Amendment. All of these things are that we must consider as a board, and it's an honor to take on this awesome responsibility that we have and to draw these districts with the help of the Governor and Secretary of State. So with that, I will pass the mic.
Thank you, General, and Secretary John Thurston.
All right, thank you. I will be brief. I just wanted to touch really quick on, the February 1st deadline, which we have passed, but just a little bit of history on that particular deadline. By law, state legislature lines are supposed to be done by February the 1st, following the census, and obviously we're past that. But for decades, Arkansas has been unable to meet that deadline. So even though we're, we're obviously much further late, or we're later than we ever have been, but historically it typically is past the February 1st deadline, and the courts have ruled this deadline unconstitutional. So it's something that the General Assembly may want to look at in the next session. So, but as a reference, mid-April of 2011, the Board of Apportionment was almost done drawing the legislative line. So, as has already been mentioned, it is going to be crunch time once we receive those numbers and have the districts complete, because the burden is really going to fall on the counties when they have to upgrade their voter registration and also draw their districts, the county, the JP districts. So I believe receiving this data this late, the counties are the ones who are really going to feel the impact of this. So I believe we're going to work as quickly as we can once we receive the numbers. And so, but it's an honor to be a part of this process.
With that, I would invite Shelby Johnson, our Director of Geographic Information Systems, who's been a real ally in the data aspects of state government, to make a presentation that will cover part of the timeline, but also some of the challenges that we face. Shelby.
Thank you, Governor and Board. I'm delighted to be here today to share with you some of our historical information. As it relates to our work in the Geographic Information Systems Office, we closely partner with the U.S. Census Bureau in preparing most of the map information that gets fed into the census. And so what I thought I would do is to start with our geography timeline and preparing all the maps. And that begins in the third year of the decade. So in 2013, we collected the congressional districts, the State House and State Senate districts, and then filed those with the Census Bureau. Those lines then become part of the geography that's baked into the 2020 block file, which you'll be using to do your work in this next cycle. For each year, we produce an updated version of what we call the municipal and administrative boundaries. These are largely a function of city annexations, city growth, occasionally de-annexation, and then in this last cycle we had 2 new cities that were formed, and those lines, those city boundaries, become part of election precincts. In this last cycle, in this last decade, we processed over 1,030 changes to municipal boundaries, which eventually become part of the precinct lines. In December 31st of each year, we also furnish the Census Bureau new maps on school districts of Arkansas. This is done so that school district population can be recorded in each decennial census. And over this last decade, we processed about 11 changes to school district lines. Those were largely a function due to school district consolidation. In the eighth year of the cycle, we process what's called a residential address review. That's an opportunity for state government and local government to review the residential addresses. After all, those are where the mail goes with the census form. And in this particular cycle, we were able to provide about 93,000 new residential addresses to the Census Bureau. About 13,000 of those were changes, where the change was an address that used to be part of county territory, and then it became annexed into a city and became part of a city territory. So households at that address would then be counted as part of the city. And then really heavy effort in 2018 and 19, we go through an extensive review of the election precinct lines. We partner very closely with Leslie Bellamy and the Elections Division, who works for Secretary Thurston, to go through this, work closely with the county clerks, receive any updated information on those election precincts to ensure that you have the most up-to-date, most accurate precinct geography for Arkansas in the redistricting file. So those are the steps we take with regard to the maps. I thought I might briefly walk you through the normal timeline for a census, and that really begins in March, when all of the forms were mailed to those residential addresses to give people the opportunity to participate and respond. April 1st is officially Census Day, and that's when a lot of folks began responding online, which is a first in the history of the United States Census, the opportunity to fill out your census form online. In a typical cycle, the census would do their field operations or address canvassing, which would be their time to go door to door, to knock on doors to those residential addresses and collect responses for residences who didn't respond on their own. And then the fourth step would be sending or transmitting the apportionment counts for all of the states to designate the congressional districts to the president on December 31st. Of course, in this cycle, that didn't happen until May 26th of 2021. And then typically the redistricting data file, their deadline to deliver those to all of the states would be April 1st of 2021. I thought we would look back into the last cycle and take you all the way back to 2011. These are some of the major milestones that happened in 2011. On February 10th is when Arkansas received its block file and the population count at the block level. This is the redistricting data that the Board of Apportionment used at that time to conduct its work in drawing new House and new Senate districts. On March 16th of that cycle in 2011, the board met for the first time. One of their discussion items was discussing hiring a director. On April 6th, they met and they hired a director. In the period of May through July, the Board of Apportionment, led by that director and staff, made efforts to go around the state and held several public meetings, received comment and feedback from the public. And then on July 29th, in this very room, the board met again and adopted the governor's plan. So from the very beginning of the data arriving all the way to the end, took 170 days. As has already been said, we're not expected in this cycle to receive the redistricting data file until September 30th, which means that you're already 3 months behind if you compare it to the schedule that is shown from the last cycle. So I wanted to let you know that we're here to provide technical support and assist you as that redistricting data file comes in. We're very pleased to work with you and your staff and assist you in this next process. And then in 2023, we will file new State House and new Senate districts with the Census Bureau once again. And I'll answer any questions if there are any questions.
I think the essence of what you're telling us is that we're behind.
Yes, sir.
And we're behind simply because we don't have the data yet, and it shows the urgency of when we get the data, we have to be prepared to act and move forward. So, Secretary?
The director, did that director begin going out before the data at the block level was received? I mean, so.
Yes, sir. The director was hired. In that last cycle in 2011, you already had the data in February, and in the April-March timeframe is when you hired a director. And so
I see.
The board had that luxury of already having the data for several months before you took up those next steps of hiring a director, receiving public comment, et cetera.
Okay. I guess since this is uncharted waters, I'm going to ask your opinion because you went through this. Is there any value in sending the director out now, before we receive the data at the block level?
I would think there would be, in as much as you have local leaders, local election commission members, your county clerks, all of those folks that are downstream in the process who are aware of local conditions,
right,
and those local issues that may inform your process. You might like to go ahead and receive that kind of feedback. You've got those local conditions that our local officials are aware of that you would have at least the opportunity to have those discussions and receive that feedback, even though you're not able to draw any lines just yet.
Right. All right, last question. So historically, how many meetings were there, if you can remember, across the state? I mean, is there some type of, guide, unspoken, unwritten guide that the board, went by, or?
My recollection is there were about 6 major public meetings that were around the state. I recall there was a meeting in Fort Smith. I believe there was a meeting in Little Rock. I believe there was a meeting in Jonesboro. So there was an effort by the board to try to visit the 4 corners of the state and then central Arkansas and receive that feedback. And of course, at the last cycle, they had the opportunity to provide some draft maps for the public to see. Of course, I don't know how you would have that opportunity this time around.
Shelby, to your recollection, were there any lawsuits filed before the maps were finalized? In 2010, I actually worked in national redistricting, and so part of my job was handling lawsuits across the country, but I don't recall working on any here in Arkansas during that time, and so I don't believe that we had any preemptively.
General Rutledge, you're correct. I don't think there were any in the last cycle that I can recall.
All right, thanks, Shelby. Let's go on. You can certainly stay there as we continue the conversation, but first, I'd like to address the letters that have been presented, and then let's talk about as Shelby pointed out, the discussion on a redistricting coordinator. But first, let's go back to the letters that one was to the Supreme Court advising of our updated timeline, and then secondly to Secretary Raimondo urging action and speeding up the process. Is there a consensus? Is there a discussion on that, and can we proceed with that?
We may, and if we need a motion, Mr. Chairman, to accept those in evidence, I will make that motion.
Motion is received to accept the letter. Is there a second?
Second.
We could have a consensus. With that, there is a unanimous support for those two letters. Before we leave today, we'll have those signed. And then let's go on to the issue of the redistricting coordinator. First, I'll just express what I think Shelby described, but also what I see as the duties of the redistricting coordinator. One is to set up an office, to be trained, to engage in public meetings, to gather public comments, and to the Attorney General's point, that's really supplementary or one avenue of public comments. Obviously, each of our offices will be receiving public comments separately. And then as far as the presentation of the final maps that this board adopts and having further hearings on that across the state, those to me are the duties that I would see. And I do have a name to suggest, but let me first see if there's any comments on the duties as you will see them for our redistricting coordinator.
I think that is that's pretty accurate on what their job description would be. And I'm sorry, this is our first meeting, so it's a working meeting, so we're kind of learning some things about all of this process as we go. Is there a, and Shelby may be able to answer this, is there a job description, or is it just for that particular position, or is it just kind of at the board's will, you know, which I think it is? I mean,
My recollection from the last cycle is that it was the will of the board.
sure, I thought it was. I just wanted to clarify. And this may be something that we need to determine also, is how will that director, you know, receive their marching orders, if you will. You know, I mean, would that be the chair, I guess, or is it pretty cut and dry? I mean,
Well, the coordinator would report to the board as a whole.
Right.
And so each of us will have levels of communication with the redistricting coordinator and any direction other than what is in a job description would be carried out based upon the consensus of this board.
okay.
I would simply add, Governor, that we want to make sure that our coordinator is technologically savvy because drawing these maps is quite challenging, as has been my experience, my team that has been training and working on this for a number of months already.
Thank you, good point. And that's one of the reasons when we get to the timeline, it's probably good to bring them on earlier rather than later, so you can be trained on the software, you can be prepared for the responsibilities. I wanted to present one name today, and again, as the Secretary said, we do our business in open, and so I'm not asking for action on this today, but I think it is important to put out a name so we can proceed with negotiation if that's an option. And the name I would suggest is former Chief Justice of the Arkansas Supreme Court, Betty Dickey, who is also a former Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, former prosecuting attorney, former Public Service Commissioner. And I think she has both the credentials, but the gravitas and the wisdom and judicial temperament that I think would be important for a coordinator that's receiving public input and being able to deal with the public at the same time. As you know, there is an appropriation that the General Assembly has passed that covers additional experts or public responsibility costs associated with this, as well as the salary for that. But I did want to put that name out there. Is there any other conversation or discussion on that point?
Well, I do think, even though we're not going to vote today or come to an agreement on who it is, I do think we need to move as quickly as possible, for obvious reasons, as we've already discussed. So, and I guess we'll talk about that when we set the next meeting, and hopefully, it'll be pretty quick. I do want to say this for the public and for the record. Secretary of State's office will administer or be, operating the website for this, for the redistricting, and it's arkansasredistricting.org. And so just wanted to make everybody aware of that. So that would be a good way to communicate with the board is through that website.
In terms of the timing for reaching an agreement and bringing a coordinator on board, in my notes that I prepared coming up here, I was thinking that our goal should be to have a redistricting coordinator on board by July 15th. It is a little bit different than what we saw 10 years ago, but they had data to work with. And so by July 15th, we still would not have any data, but I think that would allow to get on board, get things set up, get the office set up so that we have to be ready to go as soon as that data comes in. So to me, that's sort of a end date that we ought to be able to have action prior to that time of July 15th, perhaps earlier than that. And of course, the key would be that that would mean that our next meeting would need to be probably about a month from now, June 24th. And at that time, if you all are in agreement, then we can, in executive session, interview and to meet with whoever our selection would be, which I've suggested is Betty Dickey.
Okay. I would like to propose that we, do it sooner. I mean, because we don't, I mean, the numbers could drop any week. It's kind of an unknown. We just know it's going to be by September, we think. So I would propose that we meet as soon as we can. Just my recommendation.
Have no objection, but General?
No objection to earlier.
Okay.
Sooner the better, because again, the technologically savvy, I think is very important as we're dealing with millions of Arkansans and lines that are going to have to be drawn and needing a coordinator to get up to speed, even someone with the gravitas and resume as former Chief Justice Dickey.
I'll take your counsel, and I agree with it. So with that, we'll coordinate a date of our next meeting that we'll try to move it up somewhat. I will discuss with Betty Dickey the salary parameters that we have, and then we will schedule a meeting and we'll ask her to appear here for a conversation with the entire board in executive session. With that, we jumped ahead and talked about the potential dates, which you all gave some good counsel on that. Are there any other items of business that need to be brought before the Board of Apportionment today?
Governor, just for the record, I want to make sure that we have Mr. Johnson's presentation, the exhibit entered into the Board of Apportionment's record, and an agreement by the three of us.
That will be so noted and so done. All right, hearing no further business, we will sign this letter and we will submit that, a copy obviously, to the court reporter as well. And with that, it's an honor to work with our Secretary of State and our Attorney General on this historic opportunity for the people of Arkansas and this enormous responsibility that is critical really for the next decade. With that, this meeting stands adjourned.